Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. I'm really happy to see you all again. Now, if you don't know, my daily driver for a computer has been the Dell XPS 9520. And it's my computer that I've been doing my work on for about a little over a year now. So for those who are not familiar, this is the Dell XPS 9520. For the most part, I've been pretty happy with the computer and it serves its purpose. As I'm creating content for you all, especially 4K content, some of the engineering and tech work that I do as well, I am producing a lot of data. And recently I've been getting notifications that I'm running out of space because there's so much data that I am generating. So in this video, I'm gonna walk you through on how we upgrade the storage on this particular Dell XPS 9520. And keep in mind that it's specific towards this Dell, but the process in which we go about doing it doesn't change from manufacturer to manufacturer. So my hope is that you watch the video, learn from it, and be able to apply it to your specific laptop, even if it's not the Dell XPS 9520. So without further ado, let's jump into the content. So welcome to my desktop, folks, where we're gonna go over the steps on how do we upgrade the storage on our Dell XPS 9520. Now keep in mind, as we go along and we learn the steps of how to upgrade the storage, I'm going to show you where Dell has a couple of big misses, in my opinion, in order to have a successful upgrade of your storage. First thing that we do is we pull up the manufacturer's documentation. So let's go over to Dell.com and let's head over to their support page. So we'll hover over support, we'll go to support home. Now under the section where it says identify your product or search support, let's go ahead and put our model number. So it's going to be XPS 9520. And it looks like it's the first hit here. So XPS 15 9520. Let's head over to their documentation section. And of course, we are interested in manuals and documents. Let's head over to the Dell XPS 15 9520 setup and specification. And the reason why we're heading over here first is because we want to understand what our computer is capable of handling. You can't just randomly pick whatever drive you want out there with whatever storage. You have to see what the computer is capable of having installed. Again, you can choose either the PDF version or you can view it in the browser. So I'm going to go ahead and view it inside the browser. And we are specifically interested in looking at the specifications of the XPS 15 9520. So let's go ahead and click that. And specifically, let's head over to storage. Now here is the little quick blurb that tells us what our computer is capable of from a storage perspective. Now you can do one M.2 2230/2280 solid state drive, or you can do up to two M.2 2230/2280 solid state drives. Now in our particular case, we're going to go ahead and choose M.2 2280 solid state drive. And reason being is because we can support up to 4 terabytes of storage. Remember, we are generating a lot of data. For our case, it makes sense to have the most available capacity in our machine. I am going to be shopping around now for an M.2 2280 solid state drive, and I am going to be maxing it out at 4 terabytes. And let's take a look at some of the options that are available for us. Welcome to Dell's website, and specifically, we are in their parts, batteries, and upgrades part of their website. We are here just to take a quick look at what offerings Dell has, especially from a storage perspective, since we're interested in shopping around for storage. And if you're interested in the link, of course, it's right up here, Dell.com/en-US. Of course, I'm in the United States, /shops/parts for your Dell. So if you're interested in taking that link down, if case you have a Dell and you want to shop for your parts or see what they have available, this is the place to go. Let's go and browse parts for our particular device. So for product line, we have an XPS laptop and the model is going to be XPS 15 9520. Here we go, XPS 15 9520. And let's go ahead and hit search on that. So here are all the parts that are available for our particular XPS 15 9520. And these are directly from Dell. So again, we are interested in hard drives and storage. So let's head over to hard drives and storage. And here are all the available options that Dell sells for hard drives and storage. And remember, we looked earlier in their spec sheet and we were interested in getting a 4 terabyte because we want to max out on our capacity. We want to have the most available storage. Here is a pro tip for everyone. If you are interested in getting storage, do not buy storage directly from the manufacturer, specifically in our case, Dell. And in this case, you see here that Dell is charging us $909.99 for a 4 terabyte M.2 2280 solid state drive. I can get this same drive with higher performance for a fraction of this cost. While Dell might design and manufacture the chassis, the motherboard, and a few other components, they don't manufacture everything that goes inside of a laptop. This is a perfect example of what companies do a lot of times, and they call it white labeling. So for those who don't know what white labeling is, according to Investopedia, products are sold by retailers with their own branding and logo, but the products themselves are manufactured by a third party. And this is a perfect example of that. As you see here, Dell puts a label around it and says that, hey, we are selling this hard drive as our own. It costs $909.99 plus tax. But in reality, if you were to actually get the hard drive itself, you realize that a lot of the components and the parts and the design, that all comes from a third party. To name an example, it can be Seagate, it can be Western Digital, it can be Hitachi, it can be Samsung. The list goes on and on about all the different manufacturers that we have for hard drives. Highly recommend shopping around because you're not going to spend anywhere close to almost $1,000 for a 4 terabyte hard drive. At least in today's world, storage has become fairly cheap. By this point, you should have all the information that you need to understand what type of storage your computer takes, how much storage can you max out the computer with, and you also learned a little bit about shopping and understanding that going with the manufacturer might not always be the greatest deal. So now we'll jump into the steps of how you go about installing it, and after you go installing it, how do you make sure that the operating system sees that extra storage that you installed. Also, we'll take a look at some items that I believe Dell missed out from their documentation. With this information, it will teach you what to look out for. So with our browser open, let's head over to Dell.com. We want to go under support, and let's go under support home. Since I've worked in this website before, it obviously has saved my history. So therefore you see the XPS 159520, which is the laptop that we are working on. If you don't have that up, of course, you can always go where it says identify your product or search support. We have the XPS 159520. And once we are at the support page for our particular model, we are interested in the documentation. So let's click documentation. Then we scroll down to where we get to manuals and documents. And we are specifically interested in the service manual. Now you can do either PDF or you can view it directly in the browser. I'm just going to go ahead and view it directly in the browser. So let's head over to removing and installing components, since that's the one that we are interested in doing. And we are concerned with the solid state drive, which is the storage in the computer. And in this section, there's a couple of sections in here that talks about removing solid state drive 1, installing solid state drive 1, and then it removes solid state 2 and installing solid state 2. So if you're unsure of which one of these to click, one of the things that you always have to do is familiarize yourself with the components that are inside the XPS 9520, or any computer for that matter. So let's take a quick look at what those major components are. And we can do that by clicking major components of XPS 159520. And this service manual does a very good job of breaking out which of the components that you need in order to make sure that you upgrade the storage on this computer properly. Now, upon looking at the major components of the XPS 159520, we can see here that we're interested in either solid state drive 2 or solid state drive 1. Now, of course, you can use process of elimination and figure out that, okay, we have one already inside of the computer and we're running out of space like I talked about earlier. So therefore, chances are that we are interested in drive number 2. So now that we know that we want to work with installing a second drive in the machine, let's go ahead and actually follow those instructions by clicking on the installing the solid state drive 2. Here we are in the section of the service manual where it talks all about installing the solid state drive number 2. There's a whole list of instructions here between the prerequisites to follow and of course the steps to install the solid state drive. There's even a little section down here that talks about the next steps, and of course you want to follow these next steps after you're done installing the solid state drive with the thermal bracket. I think one of the misses that Dell has in their documentation is if you're going to put hyperlinks in the documentation, and specifically if we were to follow this to the T, there's nothing in here about taking the base cover off in order to get to the point where you even install the solid state drive. Documentation always has to be clear, and the steps always have to follow in sequential order. So if I'm a person who's coming in and I'm just interested in installing the solid state drive, naturally, of course, logic tells us that we have to open up the computer to be able to install it. But I think this is a small little miss where Dell should have pointed it out clearly that, hey, we need to remove the base cover. And I don't see that listed anywhere at all in this section where it talks about installing the solid state drive too. So in order to get to the point where we can install the solid state drive, let's head over to the section where we have to remove the base cover. So here we are in the removing the base cover portion of the service manual. And one of the first things that I wanted to point out is that we need to have the prerequisites completed for removing the base cover. And in this case, for prerequisites, we have to follow the procedures in before working inside your computer. So let's head over to before working inside your computer and let's get that completed. And then after that, we'll come back to removing the base cover. The first thing that we want to do is we want to save and close all open files and open applications. And then, of course, you want to shut down the computer, and it gives you the steps in order to do that. In our particular case here, the computer was already shut down because I didn't have any applications up, and I held the power button until the computer turned off. Not exactly what it said in the manual. It's another way of getting the job done if you're not concerned about saving anything. And in my particular case, I wasn't. Once you're done shutting down the computer, of course, the next thing to do is disconnect the computer from any attached devices and also electrical outlets. And in our particular case here, we are just disconnecting an adapter that I had on the machine. Everything else was disconnected, of course. The manual says to disconnect all attached network devices and peripherals, right? So we've already done that. So we've actually completed step 3 and 4. And then, of course, it says remove any media cards or optical discs for your computer, if applicable, for step 5. That doesn't apply to us. We didn't have anything connected. With steps 1 through 5 in before working inside your computer complete, we can now head over to removing the base cover and complete the following steps in that section of the service manual. So now that we're in removing the base cover, it says that we need to have step 1 completed prior to working on this. And we are all done with that, so we can move on to the next part. And in the next part, it tells us that we want to remove all 8 screws around the base. There are 8 T5 Torx screws. There is a specific kit that I have in order to remove these screws. Another great item about that electronic kit that I recommended earlier, the plastic scribes are included in that kit. So you don't need to buy anything extra while you're working on this particular machine. I'll leave a link in the description so that way you can purchase the same screw set that I did that helped me accomplish this. And it's always good to have these lying around in case you're working on electronics. After removing all 8 screws, the next item on the list is to use a plastic scribe in order to remove the base cover. And you want to use that plastic scribe in the specific manner in which it's shown in this particular diagram. And again, I'll leave a little picture up there so that way you can all follow it. And again, it's very important to follow exactly how the instructions have it. So you want to go from step 1, step 2, step 3, 4, 5, and 6, of course. And in my particular case, I've actually already done a lot of the prying in advance. Even though the video shows that I'm doing it a little bit differently, I've actually already followed the steps exactly the way the manual has it. And once you remove those 8 screws, you want to make sure that you're careful in how you remove the base cover. When you're removing the base cover, you want to make sure that you're following all the caution notes that are inside of the service manual, so that way when you are removing the base cover, you are not damaging anything inside of the computer. So specifically, one of the items that are called out is the display FPC. With the computer open, the next thing on the list, this is not even in Dell's documentation. So I think this is a huge miss for Dell, and I really believe that they should have put this in their documentation. It is to clean the internals of the computer. It's not often that we have the computer open in this manner. And after some time of using the computer, naturally, you're going to have dust and dirt inside of the computer. And it makes sense to go ahead and clean the computer in order to make sure that the computer is performing at its optimal performance. During the video, you're going to see me use an air duster and air vacuum. It's a 2-in-1, and I am going to be using that in order to clean the vents in the computer. You're going to see me focus a lot in the area where the fans are, and also where you have the heat pipes and where you have the exhaust vents. The reason why we want to clean the computer and make sure that there's no dust and dirt is to prevent thermal throttling. So for those who don't know what thermal throttling is a built-in feature inside of each component. So when you think of what's inside of a computer, you have a CPU, you have a graphics processing unit. All of these components inside have been engineered in order to protect themselves from burning up due to increased temperatures. As an example, if we look at the processor, as your processor works hard in order to crunch as much data as possible, in order to do that, the CPU has to work faster than normal. In order for the CPU to work faster than normal, it has to increase its clock speed. With the higher clock speed, that draws more power. And in drawing more power, more heat is generated. With your CPU producing so much heat, this is where your fans, heat pipes, and exhaust vents come into play. The heat pipes capture the heat produced by the CPU and carries that heat to the exhaust vents where it's pushed out of the computer, making sure that temperatures stay cool so your computer can continue to work as hard as it's working. If your computer is full of dust and dirt, it will prevent removing that heat as quickly as possible away from the computer. Thus, the temperature of your components, and specifically we're speaking about the CPU in this case, the temperatures of the CPU will increase. There are built-in mechanisms within the CPU that monitors the temperature, and if it reaches a certain point where it gets too hot, that's when you have thermal throttling, which will decrease the performance of your CPU in order to make sure that it doesn't burn up. So making sure that your computer is clean and free of dust is an absolute must. And I believe that Dell made a big miss in not including this as part of the instructions when it comes to working with your computer. If you're interested in grabbing the same air duster and vacuum, the 2-in-1 that I use in this video, a link will be in the description where you can go ahead and check that out. Hey guys, quick pause. Hopefully you're enjoying the content. If you are enjoying the content and you find that it provides value, make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so you don't miss out when we upload to the channel. Make sure to give me a like for the video as it helps the channel grow. Share the video with a family member or friend so that way they can learn all about engineering, tech, and finances. Also, leave me a comment. Do you guys have any questions on what you learned so far? I would love to hear from you. So let's head back to the content. Now, the next item on the list is to actually disconnect the battery from the motherboard. And in my particular case, I have this, looks like piece of tape that is holding down in place the battery connector with the actual motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. After removing that piece of tape, we can then use the plastic scribe that we were using earlier in order to push down the connector to remove the battery connector from the motherboard. After removing the battery connector from the motherboard, the next item on the list is to turn over the computer, and we press the power button for 15 seconds in order to drain the free power. And this is to make sure that we don't have any additional power inside of the computer after removing the battery connector from the motherboard. With all the steps completed, we can now head back to installing the solid state drive section in the service manual, and we can complete all the steps in there to finally install our solid state drive. So let's head back over there. So we're back in installing solid state drive 2 section of the service manual. And there's a couple of things that we need to go over as far as prerequisites and the steps to complete this. So let's take a look at that and do them in real time. So of course we want to follow the caution sign here, and it tells us that solid state drives are fragile and that we should of course exercise care when handling it. And then it also tells us a little note here that our computer supports 2 solid state drives, and we already figured that out because we looked at the specs of the machine. If you're extending the storage and you're putting 2 in there like we're doing in our case, you, of course, leave the primary in, and then if available, which we know it's available because we looked at the specs, you install the secondary solid-state drive in the drive number 2 slot. So below, it gives us a good representation of where we need to work at in what region, so we see that over here, and it even shows us how to go about installing the solid-state drive. So it shows us that you got to install the drive itself first, and then afterwards you put the thermal bracket, which is awesome. So it says, of course, step 1, align the notch. Step 2 is gently slide the drive into the solid state drive slot. And then step 3, you slide the solid state drive thermal bracket into the peg of the system board, and you align the screw hole to make sure that you can screw it down to the system board. On the 4th step, to replace the screw, so that way we can make sure that the screw secures that thermal bracket and the solid state drive to the system board. Okay, so that seems all fine and dandy. We basically read the instructions, we understand what to do, what the steps are, but here's one of the big problems. And let's head back to installing the solid state drive number 2 so you can see what I mean. So if we look at this documentation here, nowhere on this documentation, and I think this was a huge miss by Dell, and it's quite unfortunate because I think they need to be very specific when they're working with their customers, because this has caused me some headaches. And I hope this video helps you in capturing these mistakes that the manufacturers make so you don't experienced the same headaches that I did. And what am I referring to? They say the size of the solid state thermal drive bracket varies based on storage type. Yes, the size of the solid state thermal drive bracket varies based on the storage type, but also the thermal bracket also varies based on the slot number. And this is something that's not called out, and I had to learn the hard way. You can see that this thermal bracket, which is primary slot 1, is very different from this bracket in primary slot 2. And specifically, you want to look at the peg section. Here is the peg for primary slot 1, and here's the peg for slot number 2. And you can see that they're very, very different. And it's interesting because in this entire documentation, nothing here calls that out specifically. One would just go out to the internet and say, hey, I need a thermal bracket for my Dell XPS 9520. I went out to Amazon and I looked to see what brackets were available for installing a solid state drive, and there was quite a number of options and I didn't know which one to pick. And funny enough, when I was shopping for it, I ended up picking the primary 1 slot thermal bracket, which obviously, looking at this picture and knowing it after the fact, doesn't fit in slot number 2 because the peg holes don't align. So after I took the computer apart and realized that this isn't working, and I realized where the mistake was, I actually had to go back online, and specifically on Amazon, and I had to go ahead and find the right one, the one that fits slot number 2. And then I had to order the right thermal bracket and wait for that to come in to then finally be able to install my solid state drive in slot number 2. So as a favor to all of you, whoever is working on the Dell XPS 9520 out there, I'm going to put links in the description where you can find the right part number for slot number 1 and the right part number for slot number 2. So make sure you check out those links in the description. After we install the solid state drive and we install the thermal bracket to go with it, we're now ready to go into the next steps. And of course, as we see here in the next steps, we have to install the base cover. And then after we're done installing the base cover, we follow the procedures and after working inside of your computer. So let's head over to installing the base cover. And as you see here, the base cover talks about installing the battery, and then of course, installing the 8 screws back on the base cover itself. So let's jump into that. And lastly, of course, once everything is done, we can then connect our battery to the system board. And once all those steps are completed, we can then move on to installing the base cover. Installing the base cover is just following the instructions, but in reverse like we did last time. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up the process so you can look at what it's like to install the base cover. And remember, there are screws that are holding the base cover in, so you also want to make sure that you install those screws and make sure they're the right screws as well. Last item on the list, and of course, I can't say this is a big miss for Dell because unfortunately, Dell doesn't make Windows operating system. That's a Microsoft product. I would have probably mentioned something in the documentation saying that you at least need to take this step and at least point somebody in the direction because you want to make sure that everything is complete and you don't want to leave them hanging as to what you need to do next. So what am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to if you're in Windows, and specifically, of course, we're using Windows 11 here, you have to go into the disk management and you have to prepare the disk in order for the disk to be able to be read by the operating system. So how we do that is, and again, this is in Windows 11, you have to right click the start button. Then you go up to where it says disk management. And once you get into disk management, of course, you're going to see this little sign that pops up here. And the sign basically tells us that we have to initialize a disk, and it asks us which particular partition style do we want to choose. If you're unsure, always select GPT as that's the newer style than MBR. MBR is the older partition table. And we're going to go ahead and click OK on that. And then afterwards here, you'll see our disk management. And you'll see here that I have disk 0, which was our primary disk, and disk 1, which is our, of course, the new disk that we just installed. So under disk 1, in the section where it says unallocated, we want to go ahead and right click that section where it says unallocated. And then we want to click on where it says new simple volume. After clicking new simple volume, you'll get this window that comes up. And in the window, we want to click next. Here's where you get to allocate the size of this new simple volume. And of course, we want to make sure that we max it out because we want to have 100% of the disk available to us. So let's just leave it at default and hit next. Next, it asks us to assign a drive letter for this particular new volume. I'm going to go ahead and leave it as default and leave it as, in my particular case, D. Your particular case might be something different. We could just leave this as default and just click next. Now we get into the section where it says format partition. And here is where you get to pick the file system. And of course, because this is Windows, the file system is going to be NTFS, so we can leave that alone. Allocation unit size, we can leave as default. Volume label, you can actually change that and use whatever volume label you like. In my particular case here, I'm just going to leave that as new volume, the default. Everything here is going to be default, so I'm just going to hit next. And after clicking next, you get a wizard that just basically gives you a recap of all the settings that you chose. So in this case, we can just hit finish. And after the formatting is complete, as you see here, my operating system shows me the new drive that we just installed, which was 4 terabytes. But of course, remember, we don't see the entire full terabytes because some of it is taken up by the partition table. In my particular case here, we only saw 3.72 terabytes. So welcome back. By now, you should have all the information needed in order to understand how to upgrade the storage in this Dell XPS 9520. Now, as I said earlier in the video, it's the process that's really more important than actually doing the thing, which is upgrading the storage. Because once you understand the process, you can then apply it to any computer. It doesn't have to be just the Dell XPS 9520, which I have. Also, keep in mind that you just learned that even companies have some misses in their documentation, which is something that I hope you were able to view this video and avoid those misses so that way you don't have to have the same problems that I had in the video. If you liked the video and it provided value, make sure you go ahead and give me a like for the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. And don't forget to send the video to a family member or friend so they can learn all about engineering, tech, and finances. And leave me a comment in the comments below and let me know if you have any additional questions, or let's say you might have experience in this area and maybe there was something that I missed that you also want to share with my audience. I'd love to hear from you. So let me know in the comments below. So I'll see everyone in the next video.